Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on one of the most sobering and structurally significant topics we've ever attempted.
We really are.
We're going to cut through the usual noise of the global news cycle to focus on a crisis that is both absolutely vast and somehow strangely invisible. We're looking at the continent of Africa as it stood in December 2025.
And the stack of source material we pulled together for you, I mean, we're talking reports from top-tier conflict monitors like ACLE and Crisis Group, UN briefings. It paints this picture of the continent not just as a place, but as, well, analysts are calling it a geological fault line.
A fault line. What does that mean in this context?
It's where all these immense pressures just collide. You have history, identity, climate stress, global geopolitics, and, just completely broken statehood all pressing against each other.
And that collision doesn't result in one clean break, one war.
No, not at all. It results in dozens of them all at once, all feeding into this condition of what some are calling permanent instability.
So our mission today is ambitious. It's not just about, reading out a grim list of conflicts, which, to be fair, we do need to do to establish the scale of this.
We have to. The numbers are critical.
But the real goal is to get underneath that, to understand the structural architecture that links this incredible concentration of armed violence in a place like the Sahel to, maybe surprisingly for some listeners, the patterns of violence you see in an American inner city.
Or the hyper-homicide rates in Latin America. We are hunting for that common global engine that's driving all this localized chaos.
That's the key, right? To look past the headlines that frame these African conflicts as what? Simple, localized failures of culture or governance.
Exactly. That's the trap. Instead, we're going to examine the deeper, often hidden drivers. Things like extractive global economics, this massive silent hemorrhage of capital flight, and the long shadow of neocolonialism.
Our mission is to give you the shortcut to the most important insights on this complex web of violence.
That's the plan.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the sheer scale of the crisis. We have to begin by just establishing how many fires are burning across the continent, because the global media lens, it's just not pointing this way right now.
You absolutely have to set that scale before we can analyze the structure. And the core finding from all the conflict monitors is, frankly, stark. Africa is experiencing one of the densest concentrations of armed conflict anywhere on Earth.
And it's not one single type of conflict.
No, it's a grim mosaic. You have everything from full-scale, massive civil wars, Sudan, DRC, down to these low-burning chronic insurgencies that just never go away. Then you add in localized political violence, purely criminal clashes over resources. It's all there.
And a huge caveat we have to mention. The numbers we're about to talk about, they're conservative.
Always. They're always conservative. Undercounting is endemic. You have access constraints. You have armed actors deliberately obfuscating or imposing censorship. So the real human cost is almost certainly higher.
So let's break this grim mosaic down, region by region, starting in North Africa, where the aftershocks of these broken states are still reverberating, sometimes decades after the initial political explosions.
We can start with Libya. Since the 2011 uprising, it's often been described as a chessboard abandoned mid-game.
The global headlines just moved on.
They moved on, but the conflict didn't. It fossilized. It became this low-grade, persistent condition. You still have rival governments, countless militias, and all these foreign patrons, Turkey, Russia, regional powers, all still there, all still contesting power.
So what does fossilized look like in human terms as of late 2025?
Well, the cumulative death estimate is frightening. It's somewhere between 30,000 and 43,000 people since 2011.
Staggering.
It is. But even in 2025, a year the world really wasn't paying attention, the war persisted. Our sources logged about 275 fatalities.
And where's that violence happening?
It's sporadic. Clashes in the capital, Tripoli, and then critically, along the oil crescent. That's the economic heart of the country. So, yeah, Libya really shows us that state failure is a chronic condition, not just a one-off headline event.
Then you have a different kind of violence in Egypt, right? This sort of masked violence, the Sinai's quiet insurgency.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a low-visibility conflict that's been simmering since 1981, but it intensified dramatically after 2013.
And what does that tell us?
It's evidence that authoritarian stability often just masks the underlying violence. It doesn't eliminate it. The Egyptian state has overwhelming force, sure, but the violence in the periphery, it's just unresolved.
So there were still casualties in 2025?
Yes. 52 fatalities were recorded, mostly militant attacks, counterterrorism operations, and that's on top of a cumulative toll that's already over 7,000 deaths. It shows that a state can manage the visibility of violence, but not necessarily the causes.
Okay, let's move south to the region that many of these crisis groups are calling the geopolitical epicenter of violence globally, West Africa and the Sahel.
This is where it all converges. Climate collapse, jihadist insurgency, a wave of military coups, and these sprawling criminal economies. They all come together here with terrifying speed.
The Sahel, you said, is unequivocally the world's fastest growing war zone.
It is. It's this immense geographical region stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Red Sea. And what we're seeing is a wholesale retreat of state authority. And as the state pulls back, militants are just stepping right into that vacuum.
Let's start with the countries most affected by this state retreat, beginning with Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso is just a profound and tragic case study in how democratic backsliding leads directly to carnage.
Who are the main actors there?
You have Islamist groups, primarily JNIM, that's the group for the support of Islam and Muslims, which is aligned with al-Qaeda, and then you have the Islamic State Sahel. They are actively contesting and in many places controlling huge swaths of the countryside.
And the military junta that took power, they promised security.
They did. And the result? Fatalities have tripled since they took over. We documented 1,628 deaths in 2025 alone. That pushes the cumulative toll to over 17,700.
When you say the state is retreating, what does that practically mean for a villager on the ground?
It means the complete dissolution of the social contract. I mean, schools close, health clinics, they vanish. Police posts are abandoned. The only authority left is the armed group.
Whether that's the jihadists or
a local self-defense militia, or what's left of a collapsing army unit. This is why entire villages, especially on the border with Mali, have literally just vanished from the maps. The violence has become systematic. It targets any remaining symbol of state legitimacy.
And Mali, which has seen its own coups and the withdrawal of European forces, has now shifted into a horrifying new phase. You called it siege warfare.
Yes, and this is sophisticated economic warfare. In 2025, the militants tightened these nooses around critical cities like Timbuktu. They don't always need to attack the city directly.
They starve it.
They starve it, they impose fuel blockades, they restrict food, medical supplies. It makes the entire civilian population incredibly vulnerable. And the Malian government's reliance on, Russian-linked mercenary groups instead of genuine security sector reform has just made everything worse.
What's the toll there?
Mali's total death toll is now over 9,200. More than 1,600 of those deaths happened in 2025 alone. You can see how that vulnerability, created by the Western withdrawal and the turn to mercenaries, is just immediately seized upon by the militants.
And they're adapting their tactics.
Rapidly. They're now using drones for surveillance and even for rudimentary attacks. They are adapting faster than the state is.
Niger, after its 2023 coup, shows a similar sharp deterioration. And this directly refutes the junta's claim that military rule brings security.
The data is just devastating proof of their failure. In the 12 months after that coup, fatalities quadrupled. They hit 1,655 in 2025. And civilian deaths alone rose by nearly 50%. It illustrates this critical structural lesson. When a military government takes over, their first priority is consolidating their own power. It's not protecting the population in the periphery.
And that creates the perfect opportunity for militants.
The perfect opportunity. They expand their footprint, they ramp up recruitment, and the cycle just gets worse.
Then we have Nigeria, often called Africa's forever war. But the sources tell us it's really a system of 3 simultaneous overlapping conflicts, which must make it incredibly difficult to manage.
That is the absolutely critical point. You're not fighting one enemy. You are managing an entire ecosystem of violence.
Okay, break it down for us. What are the 3 fronts?
First, you have the traditional Boko Haram and its offshoot, the Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, in the northeast. That's the one most people have heard of.
Right.
Second, you have this massive profit-driven problem of banditry and mass kidnappings in the northwest. That's often linked to illegal gold mining.
So that's more criminal than ideological.
Precisely. And third, you have the persistent, climate-driven farmer-herder clashes that are happening all across the middle belt of the country.
That diversity of threat, it would require 3 completely different policy responses, none of which seem to be working.
They're not. And the scale of the damage is just immense. Nigeria's cumulative deaths across all these conflicts is now over 104,000.
104,000.
With 2,950 of those killed in 2025. The complexity is so severe that we even saw the return of U.S. airstrikes in 2025, which really underscores how deeply internationalized this multi-front conflict has become. It's blurring the lines between counterterrorism, organized crime, and resource wars.
And this violence, it doesn't respect borders, does it?
Yeah.
The Lake Chad Basin insurgency, that spans Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, it saw a 7% increase in fatalities in 2025.
It did, hitting 3,982 deaths. And what's really dangerous is the expansion of militants into Benin.
A coastal state.
Exactly. This is a textbook example of a transnational conflict where borders are meaningless. The militants exploit shared ethnic networks, illicit trade routes, a single radical ideology. They move across the entire basin. And we have to note the places that are just teetering on the edge, places like Guinea-Bissau, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea. These are structural powder kegs just waiting for a spark.
Let's move now to Central Africa, a region described chillingly in the sources as the graveyard of peace deals. That suggests agreements get made, but they just don't hold.
The Central African Republic, or CIR, is a case study in exactly that, chronic instability. Despite multiple peace agreements since 2012, armed groups still effectively rule the rural areas.
So the state is.
The state exists mostly on paper. It's sustained mainly by external forces and mineral interests. In 2025, another 944 people died, adding to a cumulative death toll of over 15,000. It's a perfect example of how impunity just completely hollows out political institutions.
And then there is the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC analysts label this Africa's World War. And the timeline for the DRC in 2025 is, well, it's catastrophic.
Catastrophic is the only accurate word. Eastern DRC is, you could argue, the deadliest conflict zone on the planet right now.
And the scale of this violence, it isn't accidental. It's directly linked to the global economy.
It is what fuels the global supply chain for our phones, for our electric cars, for our defense technology. The minerals in those devices come from this region.
Walk us through the specific events of 2025 in the Eastern DRC. What happened?
We saw an unprecedented escalation. The M23 rebels, this is a largely Tutsi armed group, which Rwanda frames as seeking protection, but which the UN calls a regional proxy.
They went on a major offense.
The huge one. They captured major cities, Goma, Bukavu, and Uvira. This is strategic. It cuts off key trade and, crucially, mineral routes.
The numbers are just staggering.
They are. In 2025 alone, this conflict killed 20,190 people, and it led to 2.5 million newly displaced people in 1 year.
And the cumulative numbers.
The total cumulative deaths since just 2005 are over 460,000. And that doesn't even account for indirect mortality from disease, malnutrition.
And with Rwanda and Uganda implicated in supporting various factions, this is unequivocally a regional proxy war.
It's not just a localized civil war. It is the clearest illustration we have of the global extraction economy directly fueling local trauma.
Cameroon, meanwhile, is fighting two parallel and mostly forgotten wars.
Yes. First, you have the long-running Anglophone crisis. Separatist movements in the English-speaking regions are fighting the central French-speaking government.
How bad is that one?
That conflict has killed over 6,500 people. It's hardened into this brutal stalemate characterized by state repression and insurgent violence. And then second, you have the continued jihadist attacks spilling over from the Lake Chad Basin into the far north region.
So they're fighting on two fronts.
And winning on neither. The country remains dangerously polarized.
Finally, in Central Africa, we have South Sudan, a country where peace seems to exist only on paper, trapped in this cycle of elite corruption.
The 2018 peace agreement just failed to address the root causes. The ethnic fracturing, the militarized governance. In 2025, 300,000 people fled the country. We saw a surge in sexual violence, systematic attacks on UN compounds, and renewed child recruitment by militias.
So it's perpetually on the brink.
Perpetually on the brink of a new civil war, sustained only by the flow of illicit wealth and the complete unwillingness of the political elite to share power or resources.
That brings us to East and Southern Africa. Here we see old wars getting new alignments and escalating tensions. Somalia, in particular, illustrates state collapse as a decades-long condition.
3 decades of continuous war. Since the central state collapsed in 1991, in 2025, al-Shabaab, the dominant al-Qaeda affiliate, launched major offensives near the capital, Mogadishu, hitting government and humanitarian sites.
And they're not the only group.
No. At the same time, the Islamic State Somalia faction expanded its fighter count to over 1,000. They're growing.
What does 3 decades of conflict amount to in human terms?
The death toll for 2025 was over 10,000. But the cumulative fatalities since the start of the conflict, it could potentially be as high as 1 million.
1 million people.
Making it one of the deadliest and most sustained conflicts since the Cold War. It's a staggering figure, and it's often forgotten because the violence has just become so normalized in the global news cycle.
Then there's Ethiopia, Once a symbol of, strong central government, it's now facing what's described as a fractured empire, multiple overlapping conflicts.
This is a nation struggling to hold itself together. The conflicts are legion. You have renewed tensions with the Tigray region, localized airstrikes. You have a major Amhara uprising with the Fano militias fighting the central government. You have the persistent Oromia insurgency led by the OLA.
And the risk of a state-on-state war.
A huge risk, a rising risk of outright border war with Eritrea. Troops were mobilized on both sides in 2025. Thousands were displaced. It's the centralizing experiment colliding violently with these deep-seated ethnic grievances.
In southern Africa, we have Mozambique's Cabo Delgado insurgency, where Islamist attacks are now spilling over from the coast into Nampula province.
These are militants linked to the Islamic State, and they're operating in a region that's rich in natural gas and rubies.
So they're exploiting local grievances.
Exactly. Legitimate grievances over resource misallocation and poverty. 783 people were killed there in 2025, pushing the cumulative death toll over 7,000. It's yet another clear example of how rapid resource extraction, when it's mismanaged and coupled with elite corruption, just immediately fuels instability.
And this one might surprise some listeners. Africa's oldest insurgency in Cabinda, Angola, is still active.
Active since 1975. The Cabinda separatists have fought this low-level war for independence in this oil-rich enclave. And while it's limited in scale compared to, say, Sudan or the DRC, the cumulative death toll is still staggering.
How high?
Over 30,000, with 191 deaths recorded in 2025. It's a testament to the fact that these unresolved colonial-era political issues can survive for decades and still demand a horrific continuous price from the population.
We've established this scale, this grim mosaic of 100 fires burning across the continent. But to really understand the structural engine driving it all, we need to focus on one single case study. One that illustrates everything going wrong at once. So let's take that heartbreaking deep dive into Sudan. The analysts called it a dam failure, where all the accumulated pressure finally just boosts the state.
Sudan is a disaster of historic proportions. We have to drill down into the specifics here because it embodies all 8 of the conflict types we're going to discuss later. As we noted, by late 2025, over 400,000 people are dead.
And the displacement number is almost unbelievable.
I just need to pause for a second on the 12.8 million displaced. It's almost impossible for an individual to process what that number means. That is more people than the entire population of Belgium.
Just uprooted, vulnerable.
It is the largest displacement crisis on the globe right now. And beyond the dead and displaced, the one human consequence the sources keep returning to is famine. 600,000 people are facing famine conditions, overwhelmingly in Darfur. The warring parties are using starvation as a weapon. They are systematically destroying farms and blocking aid convoys.
And the core conflict on the surface is this power struggle between 2 generals.
Right. The Sudanese Armed Forces, or SF, led by General al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, commanded by General Hemedti. But that is purely the surface spark.
The fire is rooted much deeper in Sudan's history of militarized governance, going all the way back.
To independence, to the 2 initial civil wars that ended with South Sudan's secession in 2011. But the clearest warning sign was the 2003 Darfur conflict.
Explain that connection.
The regime of then-President Omar al-Bashir armed these Arab militias, the Janjaweed, to crush non-Arab rebellions. That led to an estimated 300,000 deaths.
And the fatal decision, the one that guaranteed this current collapse, wasn't just using them.
No, it was not dismantling these genocidal forces, but institutionalizing them.
So the Janjaweed were rebranded. They were legitimized.
Exactly. In 2013, they were rebranded as the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. They were placed directly under presidential authority, giving them official military status, but keeping them outside the traditional army structure. That was the moment Hemedti built his parallel empire.
And how did he fund this parallel empire?
This is crucial. He was handed effective control of the lucrative Darfur gold mines.
So he had his own source of wealth.
Massive wealth. It allowed him to build this huge, private, parallel military and political machine, a networked war economy. He expanded his influence regionally, sending fighters to Yemen, to Libya, forging these early lucrative ties with Russian Wagner mercenary networks.
And that created the fatal contradiction that those sources point to in the 2018-2019 revolution, the transitional government, which promised democracy.
It was built on this incredibly uneasy alliance between the very armed actors, the SAF and the RSF, who were fundamentally opposed to genuine civilian rule.
They were never going to give up power.
Never. So when al-Burhan and Hemeti jointly staged the October 2021 coup, they solidified their control, but they set the stage for their own inevitable rupture. The final straw was the fight over how the RSF, Hemeti's vast private army, would be integrated into the national army.
The question wasn't if they would fight, but when.
Precisely.
Let's define the two armed camps as of late 2025. Their characteristics, their external support. What's the SAF's position?
The Sudanese armed forces, the ESAF, led by al-Burhan, they control Port Sudan, which is now the de facto capital, the eastern and northern regions, the Red Sea coast.
And their military strategy.
They rely heavily on traditional assets. Air power, drones. They need to compensate for weaknesses in their own infantry, cohesion, and loyalty. And, really worryingly, the SF has increasingly drifted back toward alliances with these entrenched Islamist networks from the old al-Bashir era.
Which complicates any path to a secular civilian state.
Hugely.
And who are their external backers?
It's a diverse, often mutually suspicious group. You have Egypt, which is terrified of a fragmented Sudan on its border, Iran, which wants a military foothold on the Red Sea, Russia, eyeing port access, Turkey, Eritrea, plus some of the old Darfur rebel groups. It's a very messy coalition of convenience.
And the RSF, Hemeti's forces, they're fundamentally different, more mobile, more brutal.
And sustained by that networked war economy. Their power comes from speed and resource control. They dominate Darfur, large parts of Kordofan. Their power comes from controlling gold and smuggling routes, and critically, from foreign patronage.
And in January 2025, the United States made a formal determination about their actions.
Yes. The U.S. formally determined that the RSF had committed genocide, acknowledging their ethnically targeted campaigns, specifically against non-Arab groups in Darfur.
Who is the principal external supporter keeping the RSF war machine running? The sources point very strongly to one major regional actor.
That would be the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. According to UN investigations, the UAE has allegedly supplied arms and logistics to the RSF.
Through where?
Through supply routes passing through Chad, Libya, and the Central African Republic. Now, the UAE officially denies this. They maintain they are only sending humanitarian aid, but the evidence of material support is mounting. They, along with Wagner-linked networks and Libyan factions, are critical external enablers.
And it's that external support that enables the atrocities we saw throughout 2025. It brings us right back to the Darfur legacy, with these ethnically targeted campaigns mirroring the genocide of the early 2000s.
It's a tragedy. The world failed to learn the lesson the first time, and now history is just repeating itself. We have to mention the systematic ethnic cleansing in places like El Geneina in West Darfur.
What happened then?
Between 5,000 and 10,000 people were massacred, and 2025 saw a continuation of this pattern. Systematic killings, mass sexual violence used as a weapon of war, forced displacement. The RSF, having been armed to commit genocide in 2003, is now conducting one on its own terms.
Looking at the 2025 timeline, there was a shift in momentum on the battlefield.
There was. The SAF managed to recapture most of Khartoum, but the RSF had already secured a crucial victory in 2024 by capturing El Fasher, the last major city in Darfur that wasn't under its control.
And the fighting in 2025.
It continued to feature massacres and displacement camps and the escalating use of drone strikes, which kill indiscriminately. But the human cost, as we said, it goes so far beyond the immediate violence.
Right.
Beyond the 12.8 million displaced, you have 21 million people, that's nearly half the population, facing acute food insecurity. The economy has shrunk by a staggering 40%. And war crimes like targeting hospitals, schools, aid convoys, they are systematic. They are not incidental actions by rogue fighters. They are part of the military strategy.
Which highlights Sudan's role as this proxy battlefield. It's that deadly equilibrium you mentioned. Enough external support to keep the war going, but not enough pressure to actually end it.
That's the consequence of these rival regional visions colliding. You have the UAE seeking resource and Red Sea influence on one side. You have Egypt fearing fragmentation on the other. And then you have Iran and Russia circling, hoping to gain leverage.
So this geopolitical chess game just sustains the war indefinitely.
It does, and it leads only to a prolonged stalemate, or perhaps worse, a de facto partition of the country, which could destabilize the entire Horn of Africa. This geopolitical paralysis is, at its core, a profound moral indictment on the global community.
That case study is so vital because it moves us from just counting individual wars to actually classifying them and understanding their shared drivers. So let's shift now to the taxonomy of African conflict. The sources reveal that overall violence has surged a terrifying 45% since 2020.
The complexity demands classification. So we track 8 broad, often overlapping categories of conflict used by organizations like ACLATIS. Let's start with the most traditional one, which we see clearly in Sudan: civil wars and interstate conflicts.
These are the classic conflicts over political power or territory within a single country.
Correct. And their root causes are the structural failures we keep seeing over and over again. Failed political transitions, ethnic favoritism that's baked into the state structures, extreme economic inequality, and of course the fundamentally arbitrary nature of colonial borders, which force competing groups into a single political box.
And their impact is always the largest.
They create the largest humanitarian disasters. Sudan's displacement crisis is Exhibit A, and they cause profound economic collapse.
Next up are the Islamist and jihadist insurgencies. These are essentially ideology riding into the governance vacuum left by the state.
That's a great way to put it. They are campaigns by groups like al-Qaeda affiliates, like JNIM in the Sahel, or Islamic State branches, like ISWAP in Nigeria, seeking religious governance.
And they're fueled not just by the ideology itself.
No, they're fueled by deep marginalization, pervasive corruption, poverty, and increasingly climate stress. This category is currently at record levels of violence. We're talking over 22,000 fatalities in 2025 alone.
And that chilling statistic: the Sahel now accounts for more than half of all global terrorism deaths.
It shows the sheer velocity of the growth in this region. And the militants are adapting. They're deploying sophisticated tools like drones, effective economic siege tactics like those fuel blockades in Mali. It shows these groups are effective, networked non-state actors operating where the state simply cannot or will not.
Then we have ethnic and communal conflicts. These are often more localized, but still devastating.
Violence between groups over land, resources, or political recognition. These are often rooted in that colonial-era social engineering that pitted groups against each other.
And then combined with modern pressures.
Like climate-induced migration. Think of the dramatically intensifying herder-farmer clashes in Nigeria and Chad, or the ethnic militias in South Sudan. And while they're often labeled local, they produce disproportionate civilian suffering, including mass rape and child recruitment. They're among the hardest conflicts to mediate because they're rooted in fundamental questions of identity and physical survival.
Our fourth category: separatist and independence movements. Armed movements seeking autonomy, arguing the colonial borders were just drawn wrong.
Exactly. Examples include the long-running Anglophone crisis in Cameroon, Cabinda in Angola, Africa's longest-running insurgency, and of course the M23 rebels in eastern DRC.
And these conflicts internationalize very quickly.
They do, because external neighbors often see them as opportunities to settle scores or gain access to resources. The M23, for instance, directly links that internal DRC conflict to the dangerous DRC-Rwanda nexus, risking a full regional war.
The fifth category, transnational and regionalized conflicts, recognizes that wars just don't respect borders.
No, they spill across boundaries due to porous borders, shared ethnic networks, illicit trade routes. Think of the Great Lakes region involving DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda, or the entire Sahel corridor where militants move seamlessly between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger.
And the impact is regional.
It disrupts regional trade, creates massive refugee crises, and increases the risk of outright interstate war.
Political instability, coups, and election violence is perhaps the most visible type focused on these governance breakdowns.
And its status is critical because it accelerates democratic backsliding. By 2025, 13 of the 15 most conflict-affected African states are authoritarian. The recent military juntas in the Sahel, often justified as restoring order, are not just internal matters. They create the perfect, fertile ground for insurgencies to thrive. They destroy legitimate governance.
Our seventh category, resource-based conflicts, is where the economics of violence become most explicit.
These are the blood minerals and stolen futures that fund the chaos. You have the mining conflicts in the DRC, Sudan's gold and oil wars that empower Hemedti, the banditry in northwest Nigeria linked to illegal mining. The impact is just perverse. These conflicts fund other wars, they devastate ecosystems, and they lock local communities into cycles of violence, because instability in this context is often more profitable than peace.
And finally, we come back to where we started with Sudan: proxy wars and external interventions. Africa is a geopolitical chessboard.
These are internal conflicts that are sustained or shaped by foreign powers pursuing their own strategic or economic interests. The examples are clear. Sudan with the UAE versus Iran and Russia, the DRC with Rwanda and Uganda meddling, the Sahel with Russian mercenary networks. Proxy dynamics prolong wars, they make ceasefires impossible, they harden negotiating positions, and, most crucially, they multiply atrocities because the external actors evade accountability.
So what does this all mean? It means these 100-plus conflicts are not random failures. They share deep structural drivers. Let's analyze the why.
If we connect all this, analysts identify 5 shared structural drivers that go beyond borders and culture. First, the colonial legacies of those arbitrary borders. Second, extractive global economics that drain wealth outward. Third, climate shocks turning scarcity into violence, especially in the Sahel. Fourth, militarized governance replacing legitimacy with force. And fifth, foreign intervention fueling proxy wars.
Let's focus on the least discussed, but maybe the most insidious driver: capital flight. Africa's silent hemorrhage of wealth, because money is leaving the continent faster than aid is arriving.
This is the financial architecture of instability. Africa loses up to an astonishing $89 billion annually through illicit financial flows.
Data include
Tax evasion, profit shifting by multinational companies, and corruption that's facilitated by global financial secrecy. And to put that in historical context, the estimated loss from sub-Saharan Africa between 1980 and 2018 is over $1.3 trillion.
$1.3 trillion. That is money that could have funded decades of infrastructure, public health systems, social services, everything needed to prevent the preconditions for violence.
Absolutely. And when wealth is systematically siphoned out, the debt cycle just compounds the problem. Many African nations spend significantly more servicing external debt, often owed to commercial banks or foreign governments, than they spend on public health or education. This financial trap locks them into poverty cycles where long-term stability is fundamentally impossible to afford.
This connects directly to neocolonialism, the idea that colonialism didn't end, it just changed instruments. The sources point to France's relationship with the CFA franc as a prime example of this.
It's a key structural mechanism of external control. The CFA franc system binds 14 African nations to French monetary policy, limits their economic sovereignty, and requires them to hold a significant portion of their currency reserves in the French treasury. This structure directly constrains their ability to fund development independently. It guarantees external control over their financial levers.
And at the same time, military cooperation agreements reinforce that dependence.
Right. They often guarantee resource access and political stability for favored allies.
We also have the structural exclusion imposed by global economic institutions, specifically the World Trade Organization system.
African states are locked out of fair competition. They lack the institutional capacity or political leverage to challenge the massive agricultural subsidies and trade tariffs imposed by powerful nations in Europe and North America.
So the WTO's dispute resolution system doesn't work for them.
It's often paralyzed, which means only powerful players are truly allowed to break the rules. This perpetuates trade deficits. Africa remains locked into exporting low-value raw materials and importing expensive finished goods. This is structural exclusion, not just inefficiency.
And looking ahead, there's this emerging risk of what analysts call green neocolonialism.
This is the newest conflict driver. Critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, coltan, they are absolutely essential to fuel global decarbonization, our transition to electric vehicles, to clean energy. But the extraction of these minerals in places like the DRC or Mozambique leaves local African communities impoverished, environmentally devastated, and destabilized by conflict.
So the resources flow out to the consuming nations,
while the trauma and the violence stay behind, absorbed by the local population.
That structural framework brings us to a really fascinating and crucial pivot point. Connecting the crises in Africa to the concentrated violence we see in the U.S. and Latin America. Violence, as the experts argue, is not irrational, but the political language of people locked out of the future.
This is perhaps the most profound realization from the analysis. The core equation holds globally, regardless of culture or geography. Extreme inequality combined with weak or selectively applied institutions creates parallel systems of power. This is the mechanism that functionally links a warlord in Darfur, a cartel leader in Brazil, and a gang leader in Chicago.
That's a powerful claim. Extreme inequality creates parallel power systems.
But is that really a fair parallel? I mean, are we comparing a brutal, state-collapsing warlord in Darfur to a street gang leader in Chicago? Or are we just comparing different manifestations of poverty? I do worry about minimizing the severity of state collapse in the Sahel.
That's a crucial question, and it's about function versus scale. We are not saying the violence is identical in its scale or its political consequence. What we're saying is the architecture is the same. In all three contexts, the formal state has abandoned its social contract to a segment of the population. Let's look at the U.S. first. Structural violence there concentrates geographically in neighborhoods marked by concentrated disadvantage, poverty, and toxic stress. And the sources link this physical violence back to policy decisions made decades ago. It wasn't an accident.
The violence is absolutely by design, or rather by policy neglect. Decades of redlining, exclusionary zoning, spatial segregation, they locked inequality into physical space. They created these economic cul-de-sacs where legitimate capital rarely enters and only policing exits. These communities suffer from toxic stress, the physiological strain of chronic insecurity, constant hypervigilance, and this is precisely where visible, localized violence erupts.
And the U.S. state's response, this massive reliance on mass incarceration, it doesn't solve the underlying problem. How does that failure of punishment deepen the structural conditions?
That is the tragic failure of the American system, and it mirrors state failure abroad. The state is powerful enough to punish, to build the largest carceral system in history, treating violence as a moral failure and the person as disposable. But the state is not committed enough to uplift through genuine social investment in education, housing, equal opportunity.
This mirrors state capacity failure in Africa.
Perfectly. Where governments have the capacity to oppress or fight wars, but they lack the legitimacy or the committed capacity to provide basic health and educational services.
Okay, now let's look at Latin America. It presents this unique paradox. Peace without war, violence without end.
Latin America has avoided major interstate wars for decades, yet it has the highest homicide rates on Earth. It has only 8% of the global population, but records nearly 30% of global homicides.
And the violence is overwhelmingly urban.
Urban and clustered in favelas and informal peripheries, which echoes U.S. redlining and those marginalized regions in Africa.
So rapid urbanization without inclusion created the fertile ground for this violence. The formal economy just couldn't absorb the population.
Absolutely. Over half the region's workforce is in the informal economy. They lack protection, benefits, upward mobility. And when the formal economy denies you life and legitimacy, criminal organizations step in to provide what the state denies: income, identity, and a functional legal framework outside of state control.
You're talking about groups like Brazil's PCC.
Brazil's Primeiro Comando de Capital, the PCC, is described as less a traditional gang and more a shadow welfare state. They govern prisons, trafficking rats, they even provide loans. Violence, in this context, is not disorder. It is the functional enforcement mechanism of an alternative order.
And the political failure here is crucial, too. Neoliberal reforms in the 80s and 90s created democracy without the state.
That's the core vulnerability. When public institutions are deliberately hollowed out by economic policies, less investment in education, public health, police accountability, organized crime, and private militias just step right into that vacuum. Impunity fuels the cycle. In Mexico, roughly 90% of homicides go unsolved. When justice is purely hypothetical, violence becomes rational and functional for establishing power.
This allows us to draw that direct comparison between these parallel power systems globally. Whether it's militias in Africa, cartels in Latin America, or gangs in the U.S., they are serving the same functional role of providing governance where the state has failed.
Functionally, yes. They govern, they tax or extort, and they enforce order through fear and brutality. They provide protection, they offer income where there are no jobs, they create a sense of identity and belonging, they are filling the vacuum. And in all three cases, the global system extracts value minerals, drugs, financial flows, while the local communities absorb the trauma and the violence. The value is globalized, but the suffering is localized. That's the geometry of structural violence.
It raises an incredibly important question for comparison, then.
Oh.
Why does Asia look different? Many Asian countries have comparable inequality. I'm thinking of India or Indonesia. But they have far lower violence and homicide rates than Africa or Latin America.
The sources identify this difference as institutional, not some kind of cultural destiny. Where Asia succeeded, they built stronger state capacities, stronger bureaucracies, more effective police forces, better control over weapons. And crucially, industrial employment and committed land reforms provided this dense social network and safety net that acted as a shock absorber against economic shocks and inequality.
So where the state mediates inequality, violence recedes.
Exactly. This proves that the trajectory in Africa, Latin America, and the U.S. is not destiny. It is a direct consequence of policy outcomes and institutional design.
Okay, let's move from the drivers of this violence to the efforts seeking to reverse it. And I want to focus firmly on African agency here. It's so easy to focus on the relentless stream of bad news, but history offers blueprints for success, and we need to understand what African institutions are trying to do to push back.
And the devastating escalation of conflict has, paradoxically, triggered a surge in Pan-African peace initiatives. They're centered on the African Union's insistence on African agency and this determined pushback against the externalization of African conflicts. They recognize that external actors often just make the mess worse.
The African Union's 2025 theme was focused on education, which at first seems a little disconnected from the urgent needs of the battlefield in the Sahel or Sudan. Why that focus?
It reflects a profound strategic shift. They're framing peace not just as the absence of war, but as the presence of opportunity and dignity. Education, youth inclusion, fundamental institutional reform. These are now seen as essential preventive peace tools, not just post-conflict development goals. It's about building those necessary structural shock absorbers that Asia used.
And the AU Peace and Security Council meeting in September 2025 reinforced this. What was the central thrust of their policy push?
It was a clear, sharp criticism of the proliferation of all these overlapping peace initiatives, the ones involving outside powers, that just dilute African accountability and ownership. They focused on strengthening their own early warning systems, professionalizing African-led mediation, and fundamentally rebalancing their partnerships with the UN and Europe. This insistence on African stewardship is a direct response to the disastrous diplomatic mess in places like Sudan and Libya.
Let's look at that battle for ownership in Sudan specifically.
Right.
The AU has pushed hard for African leadership, exemplified by the transitional Prime Minister Camille Idris's peace proposal in December 2025.
Idris proposed a practical path forward: an immediate, verified ceasefire, a joint AU-UN IGD monitoring mechanism, protected humanitarian corridors, and explicit civilian protection mechanisms.
But the RSF dismissed it.
Dismissed it as fantasy. And the International Crisis Group warned that by excluding key grassroots actors and relying solely on the two warring generals, the process risks permanent fragmentation into warlord fiefdoms, making any peace signed in a capital city totally irrelevant in Darfur.
In the Great Lakes, AU envoys are acting as these structural seismic fault line managers for the DRC and Rwanda conflict.
Yes. They are mediating around the M23 insurgency, trying to prevent the current proxy conflict from escalating into a full-blown regional war involving Rwanda and Uganda. The goal is incredibly complex: to reconcile security guarantees for Rwanda with the long-standing grievances of the Congolese people over land and mineral wealth exploitation. It's a tough balancing act, preventing a catastrophic rupture without eliminating the underlying structural pressure.
We do see a tangible glimmer of success in Somalia, though. The reauthorization of the African Union Transition Mission, AUSOM, under a UN Security Council resolution in 2025 coincided with a positive sign.
Somalia recorded a 7% drop in conflict-related fatalities in 2025. That was coupled with the transition toward increased Somali security leadership. It suggests that African-led security transitions, while fragile, given al-Shabaab's strength, can work when they're paired with genuine local political ownership and steady external commitment.
And the AU is desperately trying to address the persistent funding problem with its peace fund.
The finalization of the resource mobilization strategy in December 2025 is fundamentally a sovereignty project. It's an effort to reduce dependence on external donors who often impose their own political agendas. They recognize that if Africa rents its peace, it cannot fully own it.
But the reality is stark.
Very. Only 36% of global humanitarian appeals for Africa were funded in 2025. So African peace builders are still attempting to hold back a catastrophic flood with very limited resources.
Regional economic communities, the RECs, are acting as site engineers, closer to the ground. But they face massive obstacles, especially in the Sahel.
The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, is seeing its counterterrorism coordination just severely hampered by the military juntas in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And there's a consensus emerging among analysts. Counterterrorism without accountable governance is utterly ineffective. It's like mowing weeds without pulling the roots. You are just dealing with symptoms, not the underlying sickness of state failure.
The Southern African Development Community, SADC, operating in Mozambique and the DRC, has tried to link security with development.
That is the key lesson they are actively applying. Security without jobs simply postpones conflict. Their military mission in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, is shifting toward bilateral support paired with economic integration and community development. In the DRC, SADC forces are supporting the UN mission MONUSCO, trying to stabilize a region where peacekeepers are both necessary and deeply resented for their perceived ineffectiveness.
And IGA, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, dealing with the colossal crises of Sudan and Ethiopia, seems simply overloaded.
IGAD is central to mediation across Sudan, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, but it's struggling. Too many layered crises and too few enforcement tools to be truly effective. They can convene talks, but they can't force the belligerents, especially those backed by external powers, to honor their commitments.
We must also acknowledge the grassroots revolution here, particularly the youth, peace, and security movements. With 60% of Africa's population under 25, this isn't a future stakeholder group. This is the present.
Absolutely. The AU Youth Ambassadors for Peace connected peace building directly to food systems and resource governance, explicitly recognizing that hunger recruits faster than ideology. When young people have no stake in the future, they become assets for militias.
And the women, peace, and security movement is also crucial.
The WPS movement, marking the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, continues to demonstrate that peace agreements involving women are significantly more durable because they force the process to address underlying social, economic, and justice issues. They widen the negotiating table beyond just the men with guns.
Yet despite all these powerful African-led initiatives, the Sudan peace talks remain locked in an impasse. Let's revisit the hard truths of mediation failure there, focusing on the external pressures.
The crisis of legitimacy is paramount. Neither the MSF nor the RSF use the other as a legitimate political interlocutor. The SF demands RSF surrender. The RSF demands recognition. It is classic zero-sum thinking, where the alternative to winning is annihilation. And this is profoundly exacerbated by the proxy warfare.
The failure of the Quad Initiative, involving the US, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, perfectly illustrates that failure of trust and the problem of partiality.
The external tensions within the Quad just mirror Sudan's own internal fractures. The perception of bias became a deal breaker. Sudan filed a formal case at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, accusing the UAE of systematically arming the RSF.
Despite the UAE's denials.
Despite their denials and claims of only providing humanitarian aid. The SF even demands the UAE's withdrawal as a precondition for returning to talks. This perception of partiality has completely eroded any possibility of trust among the mediators.
So the UN is now in warning mode, just highlighting the arms flows and drone warfare, but lacking any real enforcement power.
The UN is stuck in a descriptive role. As Assistant Secretary General Khalid Kiari warned in December 2025, the accelerating use of conflict. But the UN can describe the fire in forensic detail. It lacks the collective political will from the Security Council to turn off the external spigot of arms flows.
And as of December 26, 2025, diplomacy is stagnant. The SF formally rejects talks with the RSF, and the RSF claims advances in North Darfur.
This is the tragedy of diplomatic inflation. More talks, less value. Why mediation fails comes down to the same toxic cocktail. Zero-sum thinking by the combatants, proxy warfare turning Sudan into a disposable chessboard for regional powers, and systematic atrocities poisoning the deep well of trust required for any genuine peace. It turns negotiation into a form of theater rather than a pathway to ending the suffering.
What stands out to you? It's so easy to focus on this relentless stream of failure, but history offers blueprints for success across the continent. Let's look at 5 key success stories to understand what is currently missing in Sudan or the Sahel.
We need to analyze these blueprints to understand what specific ingredients are required for durable peace. First, the Rome General Peace Accords in Mozambique in 1992, which ended 16 years of devastating civil war.
What made that success durable over 3 decades? What was the key?
Crucially, it involved neutral mediation, provided by the Catholic lay community, Sant'Egidio, and a commitment to a broad political settlement. They didn't just sign a ceasefire. They outlined comprehensive frameworks for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration DDR and democratic elections. This ensured both Frelimo and Renamo had a credible political future. They were integrated into the legitimate state structure. That foundation led to peace that has largely held.
Okay, second blueprint. Sierra Leone's transition from 1999 to 2002, ending a notoriously brutal civil war.
The Lomé Peace Agreement featured crucial power-sharing arrangements and a commitment to DDR. But what made it stick was substantial security and monitoring provided by the massive UN mission, UNAMSIL. It showed that internal inclusion must be paired with credible, robust external security backing to ensure spoilers can't derail the process during that fragile transition period.
Third, Liberia's Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2003, which ended their second civil war.
This success hinged on decisive regional leadership, primarily from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and the decisive influence of figures like the former Nigerian head of state Abdulsalami Abubakar. It established an inclusive transitional government and robust security sector reform, leading to the highly praised 2005 elections.
Fourth, the transition that averted a full-blown civil war. South Africa's National Peace Accord from 1991-1994, transitioning from apartheid.
This was a masterpiece of political engineering and inclusion. It wasn't just a deal between the ANC and the apartheid regime. It involved multi-stakeholder participation, civic groups, unions, religious leaders, political parties, and it linked the accord to parallel constitutional talks. It showed that sustained, inclusive dialogue connected to fundamental political and economic reform can prevent catastrophe entirely.
And finally, the Arusha Accords in Burundi in 2000, addressing decades of entrenched ethnic civil war.
This worked because of strong regional leadership from influential figures like Nelson Mandela and the commitment of Tanzania. It included critical provisions for power sharing and army restructuring based on ethnic balance. By addressing both political representation and security integration, they systematically broke the cycle of revenge killings, leading to a significant decline in violence by 2002.
So if we synthesize these 5 success stories, the 3 key takeaways for durable peace seem clear. Credible, neutral third-party mediation, inclusivity of all major parties, including rebels and civil society, and comprehensive frameworks that address governance, security, and justice, not just temporary ceasefires.
Peace is not a moment or a document. It is a long, arduous process. It requires patience coupled with urgency, regional ownership, and institutions that bind parties to a shared political future beyond the battlefield.
Let's return to the harsh reality of the current crisis by examining the 5 worst ongoing conflicts. I want to use them to highlight the central, profound theme of global media bias and structural invisibility.
This ranking, based on fatalities, displacement, economic destruction, and regional risk, really shows where the global system is currently failing most catastrophically in late 2025.
Number 1. The Sudanese Civil War.
The world's most severe humanitarian catastrophe. As of 2025, 12.8 million displaced, 400,000 dead, 40% GDP contraction. It is systemic erasure, sustained and fueled by external proxy actors like the UAE, Iran, and Russia.
Number 2. Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo.
This is the long, silent war beneath our global supply chains: coltan, cobalt, gold, high cumulative deaths, over 460,000, 7 million total displaced, and a massive continuous risk of regional war fueled by neighboring interference, specifically from Rwanda and Uganda. Congo is perpetually poor precisely because it is perpetually rich in resources the global system demands.
Number 3. The Somali Civil War.
State collapse is a permanent condition since 1991, over 10,000 deaths in 2025 alone, and potentially 1 million cumulative fatalities over 30 years. It is a permanent insurgency economy risk, constantly destabilizing the Horn of Africa and the vital Red Sea shipping lanes.
Number 4. The Sahel insurgencies.
Where climate meets the Kalashnikov. Over 22,000 deaths in 2025 alone across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It represents vast territorial ungovernability driven by desertification, state collapse, and the militarized politics of coups, which have just closed the political space for resolution.
And number 5. Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin.
Violence as an alternative economy. Banditry, Boko Haram, and ISWAP all blurring into one massive criminal insurgency. Cumulative deaths exceed 100,000, with kidnapping normalized as a form of taxation and rural communities systematically emptied. Violence here is simply cheaper and more profitable than the alternative peace.
The sheer scale of human suffering in these 5 conflicts absolutely dwarfs the immediate death tolls in conflicts that dominate global headlines, like Gaza or Ukraine. This brings us back to invisible wars and structural inequality and media attention.
The disparity is a stark illustration of structural bias. It's a media architecture that follows capital and geopolitical interests. Conflicts with Western strategic implications or cultural proximity get wall-to-wall coverage. Africa suffers from what's called narrative marginalization, where decade-long crises are treated as background noise or just normalized as somehow inevitable.
I think you are hitting on something key there. Implicit cultural and racial biases seem to normalize African suffering, filtering stories through this lens of resignation rather than outrage.
That is the consequence, and the cost of this invisibility is lethal and measurable. Sudan, for instance, receives less humanitarian funding relative to its need than other more visible crises. Political marginalization means international bodies feel less collective pressure to act, leading to widespread impunity for perpetrators like the RSF because the global spotlight is just elsewhere. Media attention, we have to remember, is not just observation. It shapes policy response and humanitarian funding streams.
So what we have seen today in this extensive deep dive is the culmination of decades of structural violence manifesting as devastating, multi-layered war.
The core message is this: Africa's conflicts are not random failures of culture. They are interlocking systemic symptoms of a global economic and political structure that finds African instability acceptable, even useful for resource extraction. This violence is the sound of structural inequality expressing itself in the language of the gun.
And the crisis in Africa, the hyper-homicides in Latin America, and the concentrated violence in U.S. inner cities, they are all three reflections of the same global storm, caused by the same core equation: extreme inequality plus institutional failure. The geometry of violence is universal.
Peace requires dismantling the architecture of inequality, not just managing symptoms. It means debt relief, securing resource sovereignty for African nations, demanding fair trade, and building genuinely inclusive political and economic systems that prioritize people over profits. Until power is decoupled from the gun and legitimacy is restored to civilians, the conflicts will persist.
Our final thought, then, must be the moral indictment presented by Sudan. History will remember who chose to intervene and who chose to look away. We have to ask ourselves why we, as a global society, keep building economic and political systems that leave so many people no choice but violence.
And for you, the learner, the key is to stay informed beyond the headlines, to reject that narrative marginalization. We encourage consulting reliable real-time monitors mentioned in the source material, ACLA, Crisis Group, AU Peace and Security Council briefings for ongoing deep analysis. Because on this continent, yesterday's ceasefire is too often tomorrow's front line.